He stood on the deck of a sinking ship, surrounded by chaos and screaming. Lifeboats were being lowered into the black Atlantic, half empty because there weren't enough for everyone. A crew member approached him, urgent, "Father, there's room in this boat. You must get in now." The priest looked at the officer, then at the terrified passengers around him, mothers clutching children, men saying goodbye to their wives, people praying, people crying, people frozen in fear. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "I will stay." The officer insisted. Another lifeboat was preparing to launch. Again room for one more. Again, the same offer, "Father Byles, please. You can still be saved." And again, the same answer. "The women and children go first. I am needed here." So Father Thomas Byles stayed. And as the RMS Titanic tilted further into the sea, as the water rose and the screams grew louder, he stood among the dying and the desperate, rosary beads in hand, offering the only thing he had left to give: prayer, absolution, and the promise that they would not face death alone. This is the story of Father Thomas Byles, the Catholic priest who refused to save himself, who turned down a lifeboat not once but twice, who spent his final moments on earth bringing comfort to strangers, as they faced the most terrifying death imaginable. It's a story of faith tested by freezing water and falling steel, of sacrifice so complete that even survivors who witnessed it struggled to put it into words. April 10, 1912. Southampton, England. Among the passengers boarding the RMS Titanic that spring morning was a 34-year-old Catholic priest named Thomas Roussel Byles. He was traveling second class, heading to New York and then on to his brother's wedding in Brooklyn. Father Byles was an Englishman, educated at Oxford before his conversion to Catholicism, and he served as a parish priest in Essex. He was quiet, scholarly, deeply devoted to his faith. Nothing about him suggested he would become one of the most remarkable figures in the Titanic story. On Sunday, April 14, Father Byles did what priests do on Sundays. He held Mass for the Catholic passengers aboard the Titanic. Imagine that, seeing a makeshift chapel somewhere in the ship's second-class accommodations, passengers gathered for worship. Father Byles in his vestments conducting the service. It would be his last Mass. The last time he would consecrate bread and wine. The last time he would stand before a congregation as their spiritual guide. That evening, as Father Byles likely retired to his cabin to read or pray, the Titanic was steaming at nearly full speed through a calm, dark sea. The ocean was eerily still, like glass. And directly in the ship's path, invisible in the moonless night, was an iceberg. At 11:40 p.m., the collision came. A grinding, shuddering impact that jolted passengers awake. Within minutes, the truth became clear to those who understood ships. The Titanic was mortally wounded. The unsinkable ship was going down. Here's where Father Thomas made the first of many choices that would define his final hours. He could have stayed in his cabin, praying for safety. He could have immediately sought out a lifeboat for himself. Instead, he got dressed, put on his clerical collar, grabbed his rosary, and went out into the corridors to find people who needed help. Witnesses later described seeing Father Byles moving through the ship as it slowly tilted and filled with water. He wasn't running toward the lifeboats. He was walking against the flow of panicked passengers, going deeper into the ship, seeking out the frightened and confused. He found third-class passengers, mostly immigrants, many who didn't speak English, people who were lost in the maze of corridors and didn't understand what was happening. He tried to guide them toward the upper decks, toward the lifeboats, even as crew members and barriers blocked their path. The Titanic's third-class passengers faced a terrible disadvantage that night. They were housed deep in the ship's interior. Gates separated them from the first and second-class areas, gates that were often locked. As the evacuation began, many third-class passengers were trapped below, unable to reach the boat deck. Father Byles saw this happening, witnessed the injustice of class division, made leaders pomegranates, were left to drown while wealthy passengers climbed into half-empty lifeboats above. And he did what he could, helping people find staircases, guiding them through the confusion. His calm presence a stark contrast to the growing panic. Eventually, Father Byles reached the boat deck himself. This was where lifeboats were being loaded and lowered, where the evacuation was happening in chaos and disorder, with crew members shouting contradictory orders, passengers refusing to believe the ship was really sinking, women being separated from husbands, children crying. And this was where Father Byles was offered his first chance to live. A crew member approached the priest and told him there was room in one of the lifeboats being loaded. As a member of the clergy, as someone who could be useful helping women and children in the boats, he would be allowed to board. This wasn't unusual. The women and children first protocol had exception for crew members and occasionally for men whose presence might serve a purpose. Father Byles looked at the lifeboat. He looked at the people around him. And he said, "No, I will stay," he said simply. "I am needed here." The person who offered him the seat must have been stunned. People were fighting to get into lifeboats, bribing crew members, doing anything to survive. And here was a man being offered salvation freely, and he was refusing it. But Father Byles had made his choice. He was a priest, his duty was to his flock, and right now, his flock was the terrified mass of people on this sinking ship who needed spiritual guidance more than they'd ever needed anything in their lives. So he stayed. And he began to pray. Survivors described seeing Father Byles on the boat deck, as the evacuation continued, as lifeboat after lifeboat was lowered away, as the ship's tilt became more pronounced, as the truth of what was happening became undeniable. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was moving among the passengers, offering comfort, hearing confessions, granting absolution. In Catholic theology, absolution is the forgiveness of sins granted by a priest. In normal times it comes through confession in a quiet church. But these weren't normal times. These were the final moments of over 1,000 lives. And Father Byles was offering these people the last rites, the final blessing of the church, the assurance that even if their bodies were about to die in the freezing Atlantic, their souls would be received by God. Imagine that scene. Imagine being on that tilting deck, knowing you're about to die, and a priest approaches you. He places a hand on your shoulder, asks if you want to confess your sins, offers you absolution, forgiveness, peace. For Catholic passengers facing death, this would have been an incredible gift. For others, even non-Catholics, the simple presence of a man of faith, calm and steady while everything fell apart, would have been a comfort beyond measure. As Father Byles prayed with passengers, he was approached a second time. Another lifeboat was being prepared. Another offer: "Father, you can be saved. There is room, please get in the boat." And for the second time, Father Thomas Byles said no. "The women and children go first," he said. "I would stay with those who remain." Think about that second refusal. The first time, perhaps you could say he was caught up in the moment, not thinking clearly. But the second time, that was a conscious, deliberate choice. He had time to think about it, to reconsider, to imagine the icy water, the drowning, the death that awaited him if he stayed. And still he refused. Why? Because it was his duty. Father Byles had taken vows. He had devoted his life to serving God and serving others. He believed that his purpose in that moment was not to save himself, but to help others face death with faith and dignity. He believed that his role as a priest meant with his flock until the very end. Even if the end meant drowning in the Atlantic. As the night wore on, as the last lifeboats were loaded and launched, as the number of people left on the ship grew smaller, and their fate grew more certain, Father Byles continued his work. Survivors in the lifeboats, rowing away from the sinking ship, reported seeing him on the deck, still praying, still moving among the remaining passengers, still offering what comfort he could. One account describes him leading prayers, his voice carrying across the tilting deck. Another describes him with a group of passengers, praying the rosary together as the water rose around them. Another describes him hearing the confession of a man who hadn't been to church in years, but who wanted absolution before he died. The Titanic was now in its final moments. The bow was completely submerged, the stern was rising into the air. People were jumping into the freezing water, knowing they had only minutes to live. The ship's lights flickered, then died. Panic was giving way to a terrible resignation. Many people simply stood on the deck, waiting for the end, and among them stood Father Thomas Byles' rosary and praying. At approximately 20 am on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic broke apart and slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Over 1,500 people went into the water. Most died within minutes from the cold. The screaming was unbearable. Survivors described it as the worst sound they'd ever heard. Father Thomas Byles was among those who went into the water. His body was never recovered. We don't know exactly how he died, whether he was pulled under immediately, whether he tried to swim and succumbed to the cold, whether he drowned quickly or slowly. We only know that he didn't survive. But we do know how survivors remembered him. Their testimonies paint a consistent picture. Father Byles was a hero. He was calm when everyone else panicked. He refused to save himself. He spent his final hours bringing comfort to the dying. He was, as one survivor put it, saint among men. Multiple survivors specifically mentioned seeing him refuse lifeboats. Multiple survivors described him praying with passengers, offering absolution, hearing confessions. One woman said that Father Byles' prayers gave her courage to face death. She survived in a lifeboat. But she said that his presence before she was saved changed her forever. The Catholic Church took notice. In the years following the Titanic disaster, Father Byles became a symbol of priestly devotion and sacrifice. His story was told in churches, written about in Catholic publications, held up as an example of what it means to truly live out one's faith. There were even movements to have him canonized as a saint. But here's what strikes me as even more profound: Father Byles' choice represents something universal, something that transcends religion. It speaks to a fundamental question we all face. When the moment comes, when we have to choose between self-preservation and serving others, what will we do? Most of us will never face that choice in such stark terms. We'll never stand on a sinking ship being offered a seat in a lifeboat. But we face smaller versions of that choice all the time. Do we help the person in need, or do we pass by? Do we sacrifice our comfort for someone else's welfare? Do we speak up against injustice even when it costs us something? Father Thomas Byles answered that question with his life. Literally. When offered the chance to save himself, he said no, not once but twice. Because he believed his life meant something more when given in service to others than when preserved for himself. And his choice mattered. The people he comforted in those final hours, the people who received absolution from him, the people who heard his prayers and drew strength from his presence, they died less afraid because of him. He couldn't save their lives, but he could walk with them toward death. He could offer them spiritual comfort when physical salvation was impossible. And for people of faith, that comfort was real, was meaningful, was perhaps the greatest gift anyone could have given them. There's a memorial to Father Thomas Byles in his home parish of Ongar in Essex, England. It reads, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." That's from the Gospel of John, the words of Jesus. It's the ultimate expression of Christian sacrifice. And Father Byles lived it. His story resonates because it speaks to something deeply human: the capacity for selflessness, for courage, for choosing meaning over survival. Father Byles could have rationalized getting in that lifeboat. He could have taught himself that he'd be more useful alive, that he could do more good in the world if he survived. Many people would have thought exactly that. But he didn't. He looked at the situation and decided that his duty, his purpose in that specific moment was to stay with the dying. Not to escape. Not to save himself and live with the knowledge that he'd abandoned people who needed him. But to stay, to serve, to sacrifice. And that choice is why we're still talking about Father Thomas Byles over a century later. It's why his story still moves people to tears. It's why he's remembered not just as a victim of the Titanic, but as a hero. Because the Titanic disaster revealed people's true characters. It stripped away all pretense and showed who people really were when facing death. Some people were cowardly. Some were heroic. Some saved themselves at others' expense. Some sacrificed themselves for strangers. Father Thomas Byles was one of the latter. When his moment came, when he faced the choice between life and duty, he chose duty. He chose to stay. He chose to serve. He chose to die. And in dying, he showed us something profound about what it means to be human. About what it means to believe in something larger than yourself. About what it means to love others enough to give up everything, even your own life, for their sake. That's the story of Father Thomas Byles. Not a famous man, not a wealthy man. Not someone who would have been remembered by history if the Titanic had completed its voyage safely. Just a quiet parish priest heading to his brother's wedding. But when disaster struck, when his faith was tested in the most extreme way possible, he didn't flinch. He didn't run. He didn't save himself, he stayed. He prayed. And he went down with the ship, rosary beads in hand, having refused salvation twice because he believed his calling was to serve others until the very end. Greater love hath no man than this.